All right, welcome everyone. This is Michelle Kiley with TWE Solutions, your host for today. TWE is a security-first IT consulting firm and a managed services provider, and we're always excited to partner on an event with one of our favorite vendors, Palo Alto Networks. So thanks for carving out time in your busy schedule to learn more about Palo Alto's Cortex XDR platform. Cortex XDR is a solution that will help you stop modern-day attacks with industry's first extended detection and response platform that covers not only just endpoint, but network and cloud data too, all under one platform. It's a very powerful tool. So we're excited to turn this over to you, Joe, here in a minute. I'd like to introduce Joe Randall. He's a special guest for us here at TWE. He's actually a systems engineering manager for all of the West for Cortex XDR. So you've got a great presenter here today to learn more. He's a great resource for us, and I hope he'll be a great resource for you too. Just a few logistical items for the presentation today. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them up in the chat. We'll get those and we'll respond to you after the webinar. Just give us a day or so to get back to you on those. But if you have any questions, we can certainly research those for you and answer those for you. And then one of the fun parts of today's webinar is we are doing a raffle. So we will be doing a raffle for a PA220 firewall with 1 year of subscriptions. After that, you're on your own with the subscriptions, but you'll get a whole year out of that, which is pretty cool. You must be present to win, so please stick around for the whole thing. We're going to have great content, and Joe's awesome, so it should be a good time. All right, with all of that, Joe, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so my name is Joe Randall. I lead a team of 12 pre-sales engineers that are centered around Cortex. And so before I get into XDR, Cortex, for those that aren't familiar, Cortex is our security operations suite of products at Palo Alto. So we're doing a lot of things around security operations specifically, as you can see from this slide. And ultimately, when I look at what we're doing in the field of security operations, I know there's a lot of vendors. You know, I would argue we have the most complete solution when you think about that SecOps suite of solutions and how they all tightly integrate today. And so today I'm going to actually talk about a lot of the capabilities in the yellow here and what we're doing around XDR. So, you know, when I think about security teams and, you know, the challenges that we see in security operations, I like to boil them down to kind of three different areas. Number one is, you know, we got to prevent as much as we can. And when we look at legacy tools, particularly traditional AV, not to pick on them too much, you know, they're not able to always stop these latest ransomware outbreaks that we see on the news. And so, you know, no tool is 100%, but at the end of the day, what we're doing with XDR provides best in breed prevention to ultimately help us be more efficient, because if we're blocking something, it ultimately reduces the time that we need to do some sort of investigation. The second piece to this that I see that security teams struggle with is just the overwhelming number of alerts, having not enough resources, not enough time, and just a ton of alerts. And this is ultimately what we're trying to solve here, is help, at the end of the day, trying to make security teams more efficient. And then the third piece is that I would say is probably the third most popular item when we think about why security teams struggle is limited context. You know, if we can have all the alerts in the world, but if there's no way to ultimately take those alerts and put them together in a meaningful way, we can take a long time to do an investigation on something that may be even somewhat simple. Just not having the right visibility, not just having the right data, but having it organized in a meaningful way. And so all of these challenges are something that we're doing with XDR. So XDR is basically a consolidation of 4 different tool sets. So customers can take one of these tool sets with XDR or take all of these tool sets for kind of a multiplier effect when we think about the effects of how can we be more efficient. And so with the consolidation of these tool sets, with XDR, we're ultimately doing best-in-breed prevention with endpoint protection. We're also doing endpoint detection and response, so being able to investigate things, get down to root cause. And then we're also stitching that in with network traffic and taking all of that rich data to be able to provide behavioral detections. So, when we think about behavioral detections, those are detecting the most sophisticated attacks in someone's environment. Think about things like insider threats or stolen credentials. If I steal somebody's credentials, I'm in a perfect situation to stay hidden because I just look like that normal user. And the way we can detect that is through behavioral analytics to spotlight those changes in behavior of what I normally do. So like I mentioned, XDR is all of these or one of these. Customers can take a piece of this and purchase it in a modular fashion. I just want strong prevention at the moment, or they can ultimately scale for the true multiplier effect around efficiency with the tool consolidation and some of the cost-saving benefits of consolidating these different tool sets. And I'll talk about all of those during the presentation. So let's start off with prevention. I think prevention is still very important when we think about endpoint and our environments in general. And what we're doing around prevention, I still think that even, some folks in security think that prevention is somewhat of a commodity. I would argue against that. I think what we're doing around prevention provides that best-in-breed prevention. And when we think about prevention, the most important place for us to have strong prevention is at the endpoint. That's our last layer when we think about our security stack and where we can actually block things before we have to ultimately do some sort of remediation. And ultimately what we're doing around prevention to give us this ability to block very sophisticated attacks is something that we call multi-method prevention. And this has evolved over a number of years. And ultimately the idea is that we don't rely on just one mechanism to stop a particular threat. We don't look at just signatures or focus primarily on machine learning. We're leveraging a variety of different mechanisms to ultimately stop a malicious actor. And so when we think about something simple like ransomware, there are 5 different ways within this multi-method prevention mechanisms and this design that we stop a piece of ransomware. Like we have an anti-ransomware module. Other vendors have that too. But I mean, our anti-ransomware module, because of all these other mechanisms that we can block ransomware, almost very seldomly gets used because we have all these different methods, from blocking it because we've seen it before with what we do with Wildfire, and I'll talk about that in a second, or blocking an unknown threat like an unknown variant of ransomware through local analysis. So I just use ransomware to spotlight as an easy to understand example, but obviously there's more sophisticated attacks that we can potentially talk to you in a follow-up session with TWE and Palo Alto Networks to talk about even more sophisticated attacks and how we ultimately block them. So, kind of digging a little bit more into the prevention mechanisms, one of the things that we've had a really strong presence on, and I just want to touch on a couple of the highlights of this multi-method prevention mechanisms. The first one that I like to highlight is what we're doing around exploits, which I think is pretty differentiated in the market. Ultimately, when we think about exploits are taking vulnerabilities in software and they're using those vulnerabilities to gain access to the system, right? And so when we think about just the sheer nature of running software, right, those vulnerabilities go up over time, and a portion of those can ultimately be exploited. So us as a security industry have handled this with essentially two different methods. Number one is patching, right, and we all continue to patch and reduce risk through that mechanism. And then the second mechanism that we as an industry have traditionally used is using, host IPS or IPS to ultimately block those exploits through a signaturized method. Well, what we're doing with XDR is actually going to the root makeup, or what I like to call the building blocks of what make up an exploit. And these core building blocks or exploitation techniques don't change over time the same way that public exploits do. And so the idea is any exploit is going to use anywhere from 3 to 6 of these different exploitation techniques. And so the theory is if I can just block one of these, I ultimately block the exploit. In this example, we block all of them, but even if a brand new, never seen before technique comes out, which they typically only come out a new one every 1 to 3 years, we can still block the exploit itself, even if, let's say, we miss the first technique. So it's still blocking both known and unknown exploits. And we've actually done this in the wild. A couple of years ago, there was a really interesting exploit called Eternal Blue. It was, I think, probably most of you have probably heard of it. It was the mechanism that, ultimately got the ransomware on the machines with the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks. When I think about that, a lot of security vendors talk about that in the context of the ransomware. And I think that the ransomware is just ransomware, right? It wasn't really that interesting at the end of the day. And yeah, our agent blocked it as well. But what was really interesting was that exploit. And most AV vendors block that today because they have a signature. Well, we block that exploit as a 0-day by using this method of, focusing on the core building blocks of these exploitation techniques. And the reason I like to point out and highlight our exploit prevention mechanisms is the impact that it has in the business. Because when we think about, running our business, in most organizations, there are times where you have to assume some risk just based on the needs of the business. When I look at like retail, for instance, nobody in retail is usually doing a big patch, running on Patch Tuesday, a bunch of patches in preparation for in that week before Black Friday, right? They're heavily focused on making sure that all their systems are up and running, and typically will assume some risk. So ultimately, by being able to stop both known and unknown exploits, even before the 0-day vulnerability is announced, or in between patching cycles, XDR still provides that control mechanism to block those exploits, and we're doing that pretty effectively out in the wild. So the next piece that I wanted to highlight is kind of what we're doing with Wildfire. And, most folks who have been Palo Alto customers kind of understand Wildfire is kind of a sandbox, right? We take unknown and we make them known. And some of this is lost in our marketing documentation, in my opinion, because, if I see something, if I block something on the endpoint and it detonates in Wildfire, and now my firewalls are protected, just the payload. To me, that's not really that interesting. Yeah, it's great that we're, that communication is taking place, but Wildfire is actually doing a lot more than that. That interaction with Wildfire that we're doing, take that same example, we might block a threat through machine learning on the endpoint. That file still goes up to Wildfire, but when we send that to Wildfire, we're not just looking to see if it's good or bad. We're collecting all of those various artifacts, behaviors, and then updating all of these different places of enforcement in the Palo Alto Networks platform. So on the firewall, for instance, it's not just the payload of that file that is now protected. It actually goes into DNS, malicious DNS requests, malicious IP addresses, malicious domains. Now, those getting updated on the firewall are really interesting because it's starting to automate prevention mechanisms dynamically across your entire infrastructure. And the same goes for the other direction. If I upload a malicious payload at the firewall, now that goes into our Wildfire, detonates it, looks at all those behaviors, and then that starts to influence the machine learning algorithms that we have at the agent. because we actually block malware and threats differently at these different places of enforcement. So I always like to highlight that because that's the strength of what we're doing at Palo Alto Networks around the platform and the ecosystem of these tool sets working together. And so, you know what, I always like to lay this out there when we talk about prevention and kind of what we're doing. Obviously, looking at this kind of through that methodological lens, when a user opens a file, we actually go through a variety of steps. This is just kind of highlights the big ones, but you know, when a application executes, you know, the first thing the agent does is looks at Wildfire, says, have you ever seen this threat before? If we've seen it before, we can block it as a known threat, and we'll block it right there pre-execution. If we haven't seen it before, that application does go to Wildfire. Wildfire will determine it and have that feedback loop back down across the entire portfolio of, or as I like to call them, enforcement points. But even on the endpoint, we can still stop an unknown, never seen before payload, you know, like polymorphic malware and examples like that. And so ultimately, the next mechanism that takes effect in this multi-method prevention scheme is what we do with local analysis. So local analysis uses supervised machine learning to do predictive analysis on a specific payload. And our local analysis looks at over 20,000 different attributes as part of an application or a file to ultimately block it pre-execution. And we don't even stop there. We even continue to monitor behaviors of applications. So, you know, that next mechanism is even helps us with things like script and fileless attacks. So our behavioral threat protection module will continuously monitor all those behaviors on that application and will ultimately shut down that application if it sees something malicious. So take, for instance, a malicious PowerShell script or something like that. PowerShell is going to be benign according to Wildfire. It's going to be benign according to local analysis. It's a legitimate application. But it depends on what script ultimately is being run to determine if it's bad or good. And so we monitor those behaviors, and we'll shut down PowerShell if we start to see malicious behavior start to execute to ultimately protect that system. And so with that said, I'm going to move to a quick demo. I think that's usually what most people enjoy the most anyways, but I did want to highlight the prevention mechanisms because I think prevention still does play an important role in kind of the decisions that we make from a security stack perspective. And so ultimately, I'm just going to do kind of a quick demo around what we're doing in XDR. And obviously, we can always do a deep dive along with TWE and their expert engineers to help dive in deeper on all the different capabilities that XDR provides. But kind of at a high level, this is really designed to help make investigations faster. So we talked about prevention, but we also want to be able to speed up the investigation time when we do decide to investigate something. So the first mechanism that I wanted to share is our concept of incidents. And so, you know, I mentioned how we can do multiple functions within XDR, from prevention to EDR to user behavior analytics to network traffic analysis. And so if you look here, I have over 2,700 alerts in this demo system. And this is just an SC demo system that we run a bunch of attacks. And these alert sources are coming from firewalls, whether they're Palo Alto firewalls or third-party firewalls. They're generating behavioral detections. They're developing endpoint alerts. And 27 alerts just for a little demo system is quite a few alerts. Well, what we're doing in XDR is not looking at them just as raw alerts. What the system is doing automatically with no configuration necessary on the user's end is stitching those alerts into incidents. So if I have the same piece of malware detonated on 10 machines, it will be one incident. If I see 10 alerts that are tied to the same attack chain, that's one incident. And so ultimately we can group them as alerts common to a certain attack chain, or the same attack chain across multiple machines. And so to give you an example of one of these incidents, I selected one that this is kind of a simple one. It's just a single endpoint and user affected, 12 different alerts that are tied to it. You can see there are a few different endpoint alerts. There are some EDR detections, and there's even a firewall alert in here. And so you can see that our demo system's in report only to make this a little bit more interesting. But if I wanted to analyze this, I can right click and open up a new tab, and I've already opened it up. And what this ultimately shows is what happened from a process perspective, almost like a process tree at the endpoint, but also stitching in that firewall alert. And so if I zoom in a little bit, I can see the various alerts that were triggered up above. And you've probably seen this with some other EDR tools. They typically call this a process tree. We call this our causality chain of events, because we're doing more than just processes at the endpoint. As you can see here, this is a firewall alert. This is baby shark command and control traffic that's getting detected on the firewall. And most of you with kids are probably singing the song at this point on your end of the webinar. But this firewall alert is ultimately being stitched into what's taking place at the endpoint and what the root cause of this event triggering in the first place. So even if there was nothing detected at the endpoint, we could still take a firewall alert and trace it back to what the process was on the endpoint. And the reason this matters so much is because ultimately when we look at the investigation process, this is a really time-consuming action for a security analyst to ultimately investigate command and control alert on the firewall. A lot of them just don't even alert on it, don't even investigate it, even though there's something interesting going on at the endpoint, because it takes so much time. You know, if I look at traditional security tools, and we work with a lot of different customers, a lot of different variations of skill set. If I look across the industry around how long it would take an analyst to investigate a firewall alert, tracing it back to root cause at the endpoint with traditional tool sets. So thinking about taking this alert, seeing it in your SIM or your Panorama instance, jumping into your EDR tool, identifying this curl script, and then quickly tracing it back to root cause. You know, for a good analyst, that's a 10, maybe 15-minute process. I would say for the average analyst, it probably takes roughly about 30 or 40 minutes to just get this high-level view to determine if I want to investigate something. And so this ultimately is designed to save us time, because you saw how long it took me. I right-clicked and opened up another tab, and I could see that the root cause of all of these alerts, all of these processes, was WinRAR opening up and this Game of Thrones leaked episode. And I can also see where the user downloaded that from an Opera browser before opening it. The next thing that I think kind of differentiates us from other EDR tools is the richness of data. And so when I click on this PowerShell script, I can see all the rich data I would need to do an investigation. And do you investigate everything? No, you obviously aren't going to investigate every single incident necessarily. If it's just a piece of malware, you prevented it automatically and it quarantined, you're probably not going to dig into the details. But if it is something that's interesting and you do need to dig into the details, this provides the rich telemetry data at the host to be able to identify exactly what took place, the PowerShell script that was run. I can see exposure of this endpoint. I can see everything that took place from a process, network, registry, memory module perspective, even file activity. So even seeing what files were accessed or written, read, deleted as a part of this event. And so that rich telemetry is something else that really differentiates what we're doing at the host to be able to thoroughly investigate these types of incidents. And some of, most recently we participated in the MITRE ATT&CK testing. The last two MITRE ATT&CK testing, we were the top vendor in terms of detection and response capabilities when we think about, and a lot of that has to do with the rich telemetry data that we're pulling from the agent. And I'm not, I wanted to kind of focus on kind of the operational aspects today. Obviously, if you want to get into the weeds with us, we can definitely do a deep dive discussion with you. We have various actions that we can take at the endpoint, automated remediation steps. I would argue we have the best live terminal and script execution engine for any security EDR tool in the market. We're also doing starting to do a variety of things around some IT hygiene things at the host, along with some, with having that agent being able to do some vulnerability management. So there's a variety of really neat things that we can do to help improve your environment, help do some tool consolidation with what we're doing around consolidating network traffic analysis, user behavior analytics, and EDR and endpoint prevention all under one hood to ultimately speed up that investigation process, avoid the jumping from tool to tool, to ultimately make your SecOps team much more efficient. And so the last piece I want to talk about is, so I want to invest in this tool, we always get into cost. And so when we look at taking the complete XDR story, customers can buy, just endpoint or just do user behavior analytics. And when you start to look at them individually, they're probably very similar to the price that, you would ultimately pay for another tool on the market. Obviously, these are best in breed tools all under one hood, so we can compete with all of them as a standalone tool. However, you really get that multiplier effect in reducing total cost of ownership with that consolidated approach. And we have a marketing white paper that you can read on this. You can even take a picture of the QR code to take a look at, the savings that you get, not only from a CapEx perspective, but also that reduction in operating expenses, because you're being more efficient, you're speeding up investigation times. To give you some metrics on this, one of the things that we found with the XDR product in our customers, we're seeing a 50x reduction in alerts because we're grouping those alerts into incidents to speed up the investigation time. And the other interesting metric that we found in our customer base after doing some surveys with various customers is, because of what we're doing around that consolidation approach, we're seeing an 8x reduction in mean time to investigate. So speeding up that investigation time significantly, ultimately helping us be more efficient. And, if you sit down with Palo Alto, we can even tailor something like this personal for your environment and, how you have things set up. We have a variety of things that we can do to kind of tailor this for your specific business and your specific needs, and how the tool is ultimately going to make you more efficient, and that you can ultimately for, financial justification.
I do want to thank everybody else that's on the line. Thank you so much for joining and spending this time with us. And Joe, thank you. You're always a pleasure. I always learn so much from you. So thank you very much for your time as well. And we'll let you all go a little bit early and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.